Hello and welcome to another Autodesk Media Entertainment live webinar event. My name is Craig Barr and today I'm going to be discussing creature modeling and sculpting techniques with Autodesk Maya and Autodesk Mudbox. I should point out that when we get into the principles of polygonal modeling, or for that matter, tips and tricks for good, clean poly modeling, I'm using Maya, but everything that I discuss in there is applicable to any package that you may model in, whether, for example, you're using Maya or 3ds Max for that matter. The ideas and the principles carry across. It doesn't matter what package you're using. So in this case, we're going to get into taking a look at this creature concept as we go along. Let's take a look at the agenda that we've outlined here. So we're going to start by looking at the production pipeline, specifically the areas within the pipeline related to modeling and surfacing in relation to a creature. We're going to take a look at exploring a theme or coming up with an overall concept. The thought process behind, the simple thought process behind developing a creature or a character for that matter. And then we'll get into the modeling aspects there. Base mesh versus model, right? And the differences that may exist between those two. And we're going to explore a couple different ways that we can generate a base mesh, whether it's building that base mesh, in this case in Maya, or starting from a simple primitive within Mudbox and taking advantage of some of the new tool sets in there to create a base mesh that we can then build into a sculptable form or really detailed form and actually create a full deformable model from there right out of Mudbox. We'll take a look at some of those methods here shortly. And then we're going to examine the sculpting format as it relates to building up your forms, structures, and then detailing with things like stencils or stamps, anything that can help you bring in some of those fine details. So let's take a look at the digital production pipeline as it relates to modeling. So on the top left corner here, highlighted in the kind of orangey color, we have concept art. And this is the area of thinking out the overall design specifics, right? Coming up with what is the creature or the character for this matter going to be, and starting to think of how that creature is going to work within the pipeline or how it needs to work, whether this is a feature film pipeline, a game pipeline, a commercial pipeline, a television series pipeline, whatever it may be. It's always important to think about how that mesh or the structure of the mesh is going to have to function. At this point though, right now, we want to come up with the overall concept and the idea, and then begin to carry forward into the base modeling. And as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at a couple different techniques today that we have available that make it a lot kind of more freeing for an artist to create or come up with concepts for a base mesh now. So from base modeling, typically in the past what would happen is that we would focus on laying out coordinates for textures, specifically within the areas of UV layout. I've put in red there that is no longer as much of a priority. There are different technologies or techniques that exist, specifically PTEX. We'll touch upon that a little bit later on, but in this webinar we're going to look more at the modeling and sculpting. PTEX provides a UV-less workflow so that you don't need to worry about laying out texture coordinates whatsoever at this phase if you don't want to. From here, in looking at the overall concept, the base model, what the creature or the character is going to be, we want to start to research or build up a reference library of textures. And that reference library may exist, may be composed of photographs, reference art, anything that can build towards what the overall look and feel of the character is going to be. And of course, from these texture libraries, we want to get into a couple of different areas that we can use these textures for. So building textures that can be used further down the pipeline for 3D painting, for example, or for providing images that we can use to detail the overall creature. In this case here, I've highlighted stamps and stencils, and we're going to take a look at how those stamps and stencils can be used from existing textures to not only just paint a creature, but for sculpting. In this case, we're going to look at how we can use textures to sculpt or transfer the detail from imagery, from textures onto a mesh to provide some nice finite details. For example, things like scales or nice fine details like that. And then of course I've highlighted there image editing, and that goes two ways. That's editing imagery. Maybe it's photography, for example, real world photography, that you need to translate into a usable texture. A simple image that is a photograph, sure, it can work to a certain degree for a texture, but there is a difference between photography and good usable textures, especially when it comes to things like lighting, how that texture or that image, you may need it to tile, or you may need it to actually show off something a little more than the photograph does. So a little bit of image editing is quite often the case that is needed there. And you can see I have that back and forth between the stamps and stencils, because often to create an effective stamp or stencil, you're going to want to do a little bit of image editing and kind of cull out or remove areas you don't want, and highlight the areas that you do want to create your library for stamps and stencils. And we'll look at that and how that works with Mudbox here shortly as well. From here, the using things like the stamps and stencils, which gets further down the pipeline for the fine details, we want to look at the high-res modeling or sculpting. And this is the case where we have a base mesh, but we're also going to want a really high-res, uber-res mesh that we're going to use for our sculpting workflow. And that mesh is going to be utilized to bring very high-resolution geometry to the levels that we would require to bring out really fine detailing. Things like wrinkles, skin pores, scales, whatever it may be. We want high-resolution geometry to be able to create those details. And from there, we would extract those details and be able to apply those back down the pipeline. So the mid and higher res exports, again with that extraction process there, we're going to want kind of our hero mesh that is going to work, whether it's in the film or the game or the television or whatever pipeline it may be, that is probably going to require a lot of extraction from the higher res mesh to bring that back down onto the lower res or kind of hero res mesh. And we may want different resolutions there. For example, in a game workflow, you may have several levels of detail depending on the distance from the camera that creature or character may be. And that's where we can use lower resolution geometry and lower resolution textures as well. So again, I mentioned the textures for the 3D paint, grabbing photos, for example, editing them and making them into usable textures for projection painting, for example, or using textures that you can kind of rub along a creature's surface to add details for painting. The texture extraction area here, as discussed, this is typically the basic of that is that you have your higher res mesh that you've sculpted your details on. You're going to use that to extract all those details out and apply to a much lower res mesh or a production friendly mesh that is deformable, can be used within animation, and for that matter is going to be used within your production workflow. And then of course texture and object association. Now we're getting into the utilization of our hero object or our hero mesh within the environment that it's going to exist in the rendering situation. And when I say rendering, I use that loosely for that matter, for a feature film sense of rendering, or it might be a game. In that sense, that is rendering in the way that you have your lighting, your overall look, you have your shading and overall look, and you have your texture libraries. The same basic concept applies. This is the way the asset needs to look on the screen, whether it's the big screen, feature film type screen, or a small screen in the sense of a game experience. And then in the very end here, and this all goes back and forth here, to rigging with characters, to material and shader development, and to animation, whether you're building some sort of creature or an environment or props or vehicles or whatever it may be, how the textures are going to be associated with that resulting mesh or model. Let's get out of the production pipeline here and go into creating freely in Mudbox. So at the beginning, I mentioned that we can take a look at different ways of creating a mesh. There are many ways that we can start basically within a 3D modeling package. For example, within Maya, and just starting with a simple base primitive, or an existing model, or even just simple nothing and creating polys as we go and building it up. In this case here, what we're going to look at is starting with a simple primitive, using a default primitive sphere, for example, here within Mudbox, and then building this, or sculpting freeform for that matter, within Mudbox to create a mesh that's usable. And the difference between a usable mesh and what is happening with this sphere is quite substantial, or quite significant. So with the sphere, I don't care about the topology at this point. I've left the wireframe on and the speed sculpt so that you can see how the overall topology there is changing. You see that it's being stretched and distorted. And that's the nice thing about what is going on within Mudbox right now, is you don't need to focus on the topology. You don't need to care as much about the overall topology until the end, when we can take advantage of some of the new retopology tool sets that exist within Mudbox now. So the nice thing about this workflow is, again, creating freely, not caring about what the actual composition of the mesh is or the model is, but rather exploring the art of it, or what this creature is going to be. So in this sense here, I may not have any concept art at this point. I'm just simply exploring a concept in 3D, this kind of 3D sketching mentality, right? And just building up the basic forms and kind of exploring what the this bust of this creature may become. And then in the end, if I get to something that I want to take to another level, here's vector displacement mapping, which we'll touch on shortly later here. That's just using the default ear. And that's the nice thing. Again, I've just placed that onto a sphere and I'm changing the overall shape of that. But when we use retopology tools, we can create a nice uniform quad mesh that is going to lay out the topology evenly across the surface. Those ears right now in the sphere, that's going to be stretched geometry. That's not going to be a uniform, useful structure within the wireframe there. But once we apply retopology, we will create a useful mesh from there. So again, I'm just using some of the simple, tools within Mudbox. Typically here I'd be using wax, the wax brush, and switching back and forth maybe between the foamy brush to build up some of these forms and structures in here and just start to explore the overall feel of it. You can see that I'm flipping on some of the viewport filters, cavity ambient occlusion, for example, just to see how the base forms are working out here. I'm not considering any of the fine details right now. I don't really care about those that much right now. I just want this base mesh to kind of come alive, or get an overall feeling for what this concept might be. And I'm just kind of playing with some horns or some spiky structures along his head, and just kind of seeing how those may work. I'm just using the grab brush here to pull out some of the geometry. Again, stretching and pulling and stretching, but not caring about the topology underneath here quite yet, because it's, again, all of this process of freeform exploration. So this is the nice thing that with Mudbox that previously wasn't as easy to do as it is today, because we were kind of stuck with the way the mesh would be here in Mudbox, and using a technique like this, you were limited. Now with Mudbox and retopology, I can take something like this and begin to look at this as creating this into a useful model that I might want to take forward and sculpt into something a little more. Here I'm defining curves along the surface using the curve tools to define or guide how I want the retopology to exist. And you can see now I have a nice uniform quad mesh that's been created using the retopology tools within Mudbox. I've taken the last bit here and slowed it down a bit here so that we can see what's happening. We're getting this nice clean base mesh of quads. And that is going to be something, now that I have a base mesh that's going to subdivide effectively, I can take this further. I can subdivide this up to really high res levels and finish this mesh, right? Get into the fine details on it, provide something that's going to be, create something to add those more realistic details. But for now, a base mesh that I've created here out of Mudbox, this is going to work just fine for being able to take it further within the sculpting pipeline here. With retopology, which we'll look at shortly here again, I can take that further and begin to define how I want that mesh to work. I may want that mesh to actually be able to deform eventually, and this is where we can get into the different automatic or guided retopology. So automatic is just going to go ahead and use a computed method to just provide a uniform quad mesh for you. Or if you use the guided retopology technique like you saw there with the curves, I was defining areas that I needed or wanted specific edges to be to define the edge flow. And that's where we get into constraints within retopology and Mudbox using curves. The two constraints that exist are hard constraints and soft constraints. Soft constraints differ from hard constraints in the sense that they're kind of more of a suggested edge flow, suggesting or kind of guiding towards where you'd like the edges to flow. Hard constraints are areas that you're defining where you want specific edge work to be. You want edges to be, for example, around eyes or around a mouth or around a jawline. You're defining specific areas that you need the edges to be, and the rest of the mesh will fill in that edge flow based upon those hard constraints as to how that mesh needs to flow with the nice quad layout. I mentioned in that example there that I had this nice clean uniform quad layout. You don't have to have uniform quads. You can actually dial in the optimization to end up with tight, smaller quads in very tight, detailed areas, as they may differ from larger quads in very open areas, say, for example, on the forehead or back of the head for that matter. Just some other little tips here. The create curve brush size is very important. The size of the brush, the finer the size of the brush, the more fine details you will pick up. So you want to use a small tight brush in order to do that. I should point out here that the hard constraint curves will follow details at the highest level of subdivision, which is really nice. So the highest level of subdivision that you're on, using a really fine, tight, small brush, you can draw those curves right over those really fine details, whether it be things like scales, skin pores, fine wrinkles, or whatever it will be. Those curves will grab all of those details so that the resulting mesh in retopology will take that in consideration and make sure that at its highest level in its new mesh format, all of those details will exist. And then, of course, just some tips here. Control and shift across the board within Mudbox while you're using any of the sculpting tools and painting tools for that matter will provide a different use there. So in the sense of using curves, control will provide an erase tool, which can also be a cutting tool for curves, or shift to smooth out a curve. If you're used to the sculpting tools, control will do the inverse action of the sculpting, and shift will provide a smoothing action there. Within painting, shift provides a blur tool so that you can actually blur edges as it may be on a brush stroke, for example. And the last tip there with using curves in guided retopology, it's good practice to use intersecting curves, or curves that fall over top of each other and go beyond each other. So not just ending on a point, but rather take those curves further along so that you're suggesting or guiding those curves so that the resulting mesh topology will build a nice uniform quad layout for you. So just really quickly here, retopology, the retopology menu set here, I should point out that the bottom area there with symmetry is specific to the Extension 1 release of Mudbox 2014, which was released at the end of September 2013. And Extension 1 is specific to 2014 here for subscription customers. So if you're on subscription, you have access to that right now. Everything above that exists in Mudbox 2014 there. So you will not have that symmetry option within there if you're using Mudbox 2014 before the extension release there. But with retopology tools here, you can see that it's a very simple menu set. By default, the curves to control topology flow will be on. If you don't have curves, it doesn't matter. It's going to go ahead and produce an automated retopology for you, or an automatic retopology. If you do have curves, this is where you're going to define whether there's soft constraints or hard constraints, as I mentioned before, the difference between those two. And the face uniformity, there's the optimization I spoke of there, where you can have either the difference between uniform face size or small or optimized face sizes. So if you have really detailed areas around an eyeball, for example, or an eyelid, this is where you may want really small, fine little faces there. And then in other areas you may want larger face size. So it depends on what it is you're looking for there. But by default it is set to uniform quad size there. So retopology guided curves. I mentioned the use of curves, and this is just highlighting the difference between a really high-res mesh based off of a simple primitive mesh that I've sculpted this guy out of, and then using the curves to define how I want the flow of the mesh to happen here. And this is before using symmetry. But the bottom line is I'm using these curves to define specific areas that I need the edge flow to run around. So I can get the edge flow around the mouth, or the edge flow around this jawline, for example, around the character and around these eyes, so that I can take this further to sculpt it and be able to subdivide this further. Or I may want to start defining areas with curves to produce a retopology that's going to deform or rig properly for deformation, for that matter. So now quickly let's get into looking at some other tools here. Sketchbook Pro, for utilizing this for developing your concept or your overall theme, for that matter. So I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty of all the different features within Sketchbook Pro, but Sketchbook Pro, if you're not familiar with it, is an excellent tool for sketching and painting. It's built specifically around the tool set of effective sketching and painting. Very quick, really robust tool set there. Really powerful way to build up concepts, and it works in a layer structure much like Mudbox would, or Photoshop for that matter. And speaking of Photoshop, it does support PSD format in there as well. So you'll notice that in this little screen grab there up in the top left corner, we do support things like the Copic color scheme of Copic markers. So that's nice for anyone that's used to traditional sketching with sketch pads and utilizing those type of tools there. Sketchbook Designer, if you haven't checked that out, is actually vector-based, so you can take advantage of using vectors to build or create a sketch with as well. Really powerful way to create really nice, whether it's a technical drawing or, for example, automotive drawings. It's excellent for producing really nice, accurate, clean curves in there. And of course, Sketchbook is available in a mobile format, so you can get this for your smartphone or your tablet device. For example, some of these examples here were sketches from an iPhone or from an iPad or from a tablet of any kind, or a smartphone. You can grab Sketchbook Mobile and you can see some of the artwork that's been produced here from people that are utilizing their smartphone or their tablet to use Sketchbook. So really nice application. Definitely take a look at it if you haven't a chance. You can grab it online and grab the trial of it as well. So now we're getting into the overall concept or theme of our creature. This overall simple sketch here is just trying to figure out what this creature is going to be. I wanted this kind of tough skin, tough hide creature that has this kind of battering ram head. Has these big tusks, but they've been sawed off because this is a creature that is taken in or domesticated by a kind of alien humanoid type creature that actually rides upon it in a certain type of environment. So he's kind of hacked off certain areas, unfortunately, of this creature to make it a little safer, I guess, for himself. And then I'm just putting in here some notes here that I'm basing certain things off of other real-world creatures like chameleons or iguanas, for that matter. Here's just a simple scale sketch, just getting the idea of what the scale of this simple creature would be compared to the rider, or the type of character that's going to be riding on that creature. And then just fleshing out the theme and idea. This is a little character that I was working with previously, and I wanted something for this guy to be kind of riding upon here. So this character, this poacher character, I call him, he needs a riding creature, and this is the creature that we're going to use for building up the story for him. And then this kind of, I like to think about where the environment is, right? What kind of environment would this creature exist in? So he lives in this kind of desert-like mountainous environment that has a lot of these kind of rocky outcrops that exist. So he needs to be tough-skinned, and needs to be something that has these kind of big feet, and also these kind of pseudo-hands, pseudo-claw-like hands that allow him to kind of scramble and use those forelimbs to kind of scramble really quickly up over these kind of mountainous rocky outcrops as well. So that's kind of the thinking in this creature design, and we'll get into him a little bit here later on here within Mudbox. So anatomical reference. Reference is definitely key when you're coming up with any of these sculpts for models. In this case here, I just wanted to highlight a couple simple ones that you can grab. I mean, if you go to Google and you type in anatomical reference, it's unreal how much exists out there. So it's excellent. Even just Google image search, you're going to come up with a bunch of different references there. Here's some here that I've highlighted. Ray Bustos here with his excellent anatomical website there. And the nice thing he has a simple little flash diagram that, you know, you can have a statue, for example, and drag your mouse over and you'll actually see the muscle forms highlight into there as they would be in that pose. So that's a nice way to work. Another excellent one for creatures or for building up any kind of creature design or the anatomy related to creatures or animals is the University of Wisconsin Digital Collection. So I've put the link up top there, but if you Google University of Wisconsin Digital Collection, there is a big library there of all sorts of things. Specifically here, I'm using the Veterinary Anatomical Illustration Library, and in there are all sorts of animals, all different kinds of animals that you can use as really good reference images for, you know, the muscle structure or forms to help build up your creature. And lastly, the guys from anatomyforsculptors.com. These guys have produced an excellent website. They're in the process of building a really nice book right now as well that helps sculptors and artists take a look at the overall form and structure for anatomy around the human figure. That is excellent for things, the way that they've highlighted the base anatomy of a man, for example, or a woman, but also utilizing different poses and how those muscle forms are operating within those different poses. So, and the nice thing about what they've done is they've broken it down by body part. You can zoom in specifically on the foot musculature, for example, and use that as an excellent reference for anatomical, for your sculpting. So let's get into the base mesh. Let's take a look at a couple of different starting points. Whether we start with an existing primitive, for example, in a cube, which we're going to look at in Maya, or a primitive like a sphere like we took a look at there at that little time-lapse video within Mudbox, or using existing geometry or models, right? That kind of kit bash idea. Maybe you're taking a piece of an existing model and augmenting or changing it quite a bit into a new mesh that you're going to take further into a sculpting realm or into a modeling realm there. Or starting with nothing at all, right? Just starting with a Create Poly tool or some of the new tools that exist within Maya 2014 where you can simply sketch or draw out polygons as you go. So polygonal modeling here, I think it's important to put a simple little mission statement in there, or for that matter, an end goal. So we want to create geometry that is clean, that's free of artifacts, has very nice even edge flow. And the goal overall there is we want something, especially in the sculpting workflow, that subdivides efficiently and cleanly. That's important. And deforms properly and textures beautifully. So back on the subdivision there, it doesn't matter what you're using to subdivide a mesh, what package you're using out there, the same principles apply. If there are issues within the mesh, it will not subdivide efficiently or effectively. The cleaner the mesh, the more optimized that mesh is, the better subdivision you'll get and the better sculpting workflow and experience you'll have as well. So it's always good to follow the basic principles of polygonal modeling, stick with those, adhere to those so that you end up with a good, clean, subdividable mesh that will result in an effective sculpting workflow for creating a nice detailed mesh in the end, or model for that matter in the end. So some clean poly modeling guidelines. Keep your mesh as quads, right? So try to minimize or avoid n-gons, triangles, this kind of mixed geometry, right? So mixed geometry, any of these things will subdivide, but you're not going to get a very efficient or effective subdivision. If it's nice clean quads, everything's welded and kept together, you're gonna find that you'll get a nice efficient, effective subdivision there that will sculpt really nicely as well. So keeping your geometry clean, keep the face size and spacing, ideally something with a base in relation to a base mesh, uniform and balanced, right? Uniform faces, so that your subdivision is even throughout the mesh. You know, if you have an area, for example, on an arm that is very dense quads and another area that's very big, large faces that's spaced out, well, that's going to subdivide differently, and one area is going to get lots of detail and the other area is not going to get much detail. So it's a good practice to try to keep everything uniform on your base mesh so that it will subdivide effectively and cleanly. The results that we're looking for there: smooth and efficient subdivision, a better representation of the anatomy by having following these good principles of modeling, and better texturing results. For example, less stretching down the line because we have good layout of our mesh, and better deformation performance. That's key. At the end of the day, it's nice to have a good looking model, but if it needs to operate in the sense of animation, regardless of what the pipeline is, that's where it will fail, right? It needs to work on the screen, and if it's going to, it's great that it looks good, but if it's not going to deform properly, then there are many problems there, and that's going to be very costly and time consuming in a pipeline. So other factors to consider: it's always good practice to check your mesh as you work. Always grab all of the vertices and give them a nice merge or welding of those vertices. The worst thing there is to have a nice mesh where it looks nice, but it won't subdivide properly because there are holes in the mesh because of unwelded or unmerged vertices that may exist. Check the face normals and do this often. Things like in Maya, for example, the hotkeys 1, 2, and 3, which gives you a smooth mesh preview, is an excellent way to see some of these issues I'm talking about. Just by quickly hitting 3, for example, you'll see that something's wrong. You'll see that face normals are inversed, or that maybe there's an unwelded vert there and you're getting a hole as a result. That's a great way to work. The smooth mesh preview is going to give you an idea of how that mesh is operating when it comes to the sense of a subdivision workflow. Using border edges, this is an excellent way to highlight outer edges or highlight faces sitting on edges or even flip normal faces. These big thick borders are going to highlight those for you as you're working. It's a good way to see that, to keep your mesh clean or to see errors or issues that may pop up. It's also going to highlight any of those holes, those unwelded, no one wants to have those unwelded or non-merged vertices. And of course, within the Autodesk suite of tools, we have the one-click send to Mudbox workflow. And this is an excellent way to do this often to test the mesh back and forth. How's this going to subdivide as I'm working, right? Building a mesh, for example, in Maya or 3ds Max, and then going into Mudbox and actually checking the overall form of this. How is this subdividing? Is this working out well? Are my normals okay? Is everything great? I can subdivide and sculpt on this. It's a great practice to do that back and forth. Other factors to consider quickly here: UV texture coordinates. There's several options that exist in Mudbox to deal with that. Quads or n-gon faces. Again, ideally try to keep your mesh quads for efficient or effective subdivision. We talked about the size and shape of polygon faces, whether it's uniform or for a base mesh, ideally stick towards uniform. And then we want good clean edge loop and ring flow, especially if you're taking your base mesh a little bit further and actually building it into something that is going to deform. And the location of the model in the viewport, and X, Y, and Z, or Z for that matter, for symmetry purposes, for mirroring or reflection while you're sculpting. And then Polygon Topology Mesh Cleanup Tool. We're going to get to that in a moment here. Here are some of the things within Mudbox that are really useful. These things kind of bluntly pop up, but they're identifying or warning you that there are issues that exist that aren't going to be the best for effective or efficient clean subdivision. So things like non-manifold topology, extra vertices that might exist within the mesh, or things like in the bottom right here, we're seeing this high valence vertex. This is kind of that pole geometry that exists on top of default spheres in 3D packages. Although it can subdivide, it's not going to subdivide that cleanly or effectively, and you will see issues, that kind of puckering effect in there. So there are ways to kind of model that out or remodel these areas so that in the end you're getting good clean subdivision on those and avoiding those poles on there. So in Maya, I'm highlighting a tool here, very simple tool. It's been in Maya actually forever. The Mesh Cleanup tool, and this is actually a very good, effective tool. I'd advise you to use something like this all the time. This is a great way to check your mesh. You'll notice on the top there in the cleanup effect under operation, I always put it to select matching polygons. It's not that I don't trust Maya, but it's that I want to actually see and decide on my own if that's something that needs to be cleaned up. There may be the way that I've built a mesh or a model that may be quite different, that I need it to exist in a certain way, and I certainly don't want some automated system to go and clean that up for me. I want it to select what it considers to be an issue so that I can determine if that is something I need to fix or go forward with. Very quick tool to check your mesh. These are the typical settings that I will use. It will highlight the faces that exist. Sometimes what you'll end up with is the inverse, right? You'll get a highlighting of the faces there, and if you inverse the selection, now you're going to find some of the mesh, the faces that are bordering those other faces there that are causing issues in there. And again, it might be non-manifold, it could be normal issues or unwelded verts, whatever it may be. This is an excellent way to check your mesh. It's a good practice to do for sure. I'm not going to go into all these tools here, but some of the top poly modeling tools, I tried to keep this kind of package agnostic. This is specifically Maya, but to try to keep it agnostic here, I broke it down into these 4 different areas, these kind of utility tools, editing tools, building and optimizing tools, and there's the mesh cleanup tool, as I mentioned in Maya at the bottom. And these are some of the basic tools that you'll utilize quite often in just doing a simple base mesh modeling, or even getting into more detailed modeling as well. A lot of these are very useful tools, working with your normals, reversing your normals, averaging your normals, or not, depending on what it is that you want the style of the mesh to be. So let's move forward here and take a look at the modeling toolkit that exists now in Maya 2014. So we've introduced this modeling toolkit that provides a new way, a very powerful way of working with modeling tools within Maya. And we're going to get into some of these tools and how they relate to a very quick, kind of nice way of modeling here with a base mesh here momentarily. So let's jump into Maya right now and take a look at some polygonal flow, some tips and tricks, coming into how we can take advantage of the flow of the geometry, or for that matter, some of these kind of gotcha areas that we might come across within poly modeling. And here we can see that we have some examples set out that I've built here, that these kind of exist as what the scenarios you may come into, or problem or tricky areas within polygonal modeling, and then how we can solve those. And then I have kind of a subdivision result down below. So for example, here I'm going to turn on my modeling toolkit, and you can see with the modeling toolkit, what I'm going to highlight right now is this multi-cut tool. So here's an example here, this 2-to-1, I've called it this 2-to-1 spin, and the idea is that we have 2 quad faces coming in here into one quad face, or this stream of one face. There are a couple ways that we can deal with this. One is to simply start to cut the existing polygons along the side here and simply begin to merge that in. By cutting one on one side here, you'll see with this multi-cut tool, I'm actually snapping to edges, I'm snapping to verts. I can even go into the middle of a face here, which is nice. So in this sense here, I'm just going to grab this face and just slice it in half. The result is that, although it is shape triangulated, this is a quad, right? I have 1, 2, 3, 4 edges, and I have the same down here as well. So that is actually a quad resulting mesh, and it is going to subdivide effectively. But we can do a couple of things here with that. So let's grab the edge of this this guy here. Now I put this 2-to-1 spin here because there are scenarios where we may want to have different flow of the geometry, and without actually getting rid of an edge or verts or anything for that matter, or faces for that matter, we can simply, within Maya or any other package there, start to spin the resulting edges. So for example, I'm just simply using Control Alt and the right arrow within Maya, and I still have quads here, right? That is still a quad, and the difference is that we have a very different flow going on with the edge flow in here. And this is a really nice way to be able to work with flowing those edges, or flowing that geometry towards a specific feature. We'll get into looking at how, corners of eyes or mouths and different ways that this might help out here as well. And then lastly, we can go even further here. Here's another simple example, and we've changed that flow of those edges going more up this way into here. Let's take a look at this here with this kind of 2-to-1 workflow. You can see that the subdivision that we're getting down here, and all we're doing with that is, let me just select my guy that I want to work with there. And all we're simply doing in here is just defining how we want this to go. I'm holding down my Shift key to snap to exactly 50% on that base mesh. And then I'm going to snap here and bring it down to the corner. Actually, I don't want it into that one there. Let's quickly fix that here. I'll just take this guy, snap him into there. We'll hit enter on there, and then I'm just going to grab this one and snap it into there. And the resulting mesh that we're getting is this nice solution into there, so that we've effectively fixed that kind of 2-to-1 by adding in geometry over here. Of course, now if we have geometry this way, this is going to be an issue where we've added some, so we're going to have to add an edge loop going forward. But let's move on here rather quickly to continue on. This 3-to-1 scenario in here, you can see that what we have are 3 areas, or the stream of 3 quads coming down into 1 quad. And there are a couple ways that we can work with that. One of the most simple ones is, as we looked at in the previous example here, quite often one of the more simpler ways to work with that is to just cut the geometry and then simply cut the geometry down the middle. So I'll just snap to keep that at 50%. And then we've effectively blended this 3-to-1 together to result in this kind of subdivision that will work for 3 quads into 1 quad face there. Similarly here, 4-to-2, I mean the idea here is very much the same as what we saw in 2-to-1. You know, we may come into a scenario like this where what we need to do is actually end up chopping out one side, much like we did over here, so that we're ending up with this here. Just by quickly, I'll just do the one side here. By quickly, you know, cutting I can actually snap that to the middle there, and then snap into the middle of that one and bring it this way. And then, you know, we're getting that side there is creating a nice overall subdivision on there. And we can cut this guy here further. And our result is something like this, so that we get this nice subdivision or 4-to-2 blending of as it goes. So the last one here, 5-to-3, exact same concept as we looked at. The only difference that we're doing here is rather, you know, kind of cutting down this way, and then just adding an insert here in the middle. So I'll use my shift key to snap 50% so it's nice and even throughout there. And then if we hit 3, we can see that we're getting this result here with subdivision. So kind of this 5 quads to 3 quads. This is excellent for areas like the corner of a mouth or an eye, for example, much like we saw back here, that we could utilize some of these for that. This is an excellent way to do that around features that require, you know, maybe deformation or the edges to start to flow around the middle of that. So those are just some tips and tricks, or these gotcha kind of areas in here. And I think it's worth pointing out that we have this is kind of a chart that I used based upon an existing step down guide that exists on pixelandpoly.com. Check out his website. He's done a great job there. And this is a way to kind of that guide to how you can get out of these kind of gotcha areas by blending in different face counts with polygonal modeling. Reference tables. So this is excellent here. Pedro Amaro, he has created this polygonal table for 3D modeling, and he has actually taken this further. There's actually little flash animations on there that will show you the end result by fixing or addressing some of these issues here by stepping between the different face counts. I would definitely recommend you check out his work there. The easiest way would be to go to Pedro Amaro. You can Google his website. I actually do have the reference to his link coming up here. Let's take a look at the base mesh simple steps. So rather quickly, I just want to step through some of these. You know, we took a look at these we're going to look at the starting point of this cube. We took a look at these principles for modeling here. So this is just a simple cube. We're going to start building out the base overall. I'm using some of these tools here. This is Maya, for example. I'm using the knife or a cut faces tool. And in here, what we want to do is focus on the base shape of it right now. We just want to start to box model in the base shape. And this is just using simple poly tools just to get into sliding, inserting edges, just to start to build up that overall shape of the base model. Using tools like extrusion, extruding up for the upper mouth. And then you can see I'm splitting the mesh in half, refining the edges here, starting to think of how the mesh is going to work for, this is the head that I'm working on. I'm using tools like interactive split or the multi-cut tool within the modeling toolkit, and then starting to duplicate, get the negative value and merge those two together. and then bringing in image planes. So now we're starting to use this as a guide for how the simple base mesh is going to fit to the overall sense of the creature itself. And then we start to add in edge loops, or even grab edge loops and delete them as we may not need some. You can see here that the faces right now are not uniform, but as we go along and start to box out our base mesh, I can start to worry about making them uniform. Of course, working with mirroring geometry or mirroring the other side, it's always a good practice to keep the right down the middle, the mirroring edge, nice and flat so that everything will mirror properly as we model. And I can have that so that I can look at the mirroring back and forth, but sometimes I just want to work on one side and then I'll kind of quickly hit the mirror geometry just to take a look at what the end result is. Or I might even model it further, like in this case here, blocking out the crest structure on the simple base mesh, and then doing smooth mesh preview by hitting the 3 key within Maya to see how this is, how the overall box modeling is working out for previewing the mesh. Blocking in the body, same thing, just a simple cube. Putting in some edge loops, lining it up to the reference image planes. And these image planes work whether you're using Maya, Max, Mudbox, for example. You can bring them back and forth between the apps so that you can work with them in the same way. I'm using a bridge tool here. I'm just bridging the head to the body to create an effective neck blend in there. I was using the relax tool to start to relax out the geometry, and now I'm just simply cutting out areas to delete faces, to rough in the simple leg and the forelimb of the arm. And we're just using a simple bridge on there to bridge that in. You can see how simple this base mesh structure is. Very simple base mesh that we could now take into a sculpting pipeline. Or maybe we want to take this base mesh a little bit further to define certain specific areas within the mesh to define certain features on there. So here's using mirroring or reflection with soft selection to start to build out the overall form of it. There's the simple base mesh. Like I said, we could take this and sculpt it up further and be able to build a whole new model from it, retopologize that and bring it back. Or maybe we want to define some of the areas here by refining this mesh to define things like nostrils, the eye socket or the ear, or the ear structure there, or this area that the tusks exist on this creature, and even defining some basic areas that later on we might really want to define for deformation. So here are some basic areas, but later on we're going to want to define those edge loops if we want to bring this character into rigging. So that's that. Let's hop back into I brought up some of those resources for polygonal modeling there. An excellent resource is Southern GFX, or Glenn Southern does an excellent job here. He has a multi-page document on there for 3D modeling, and polygon tables for 3D modeling by Pedro Amaro. There's his link, and for how to deal with moving the poles around on mesh as well. Definitely check them out. Excellent resources there. So what is Mudbox? We don't need to dive into the full intricacies of everything about Mudbox here, but we want to focus more on the sculpting of it here. So Mudbox, working within sculpting or building a nice detailed mesh to extract some of the details out and apply them into your production pipeline, whether it's feature film or a game pipeline. So creating effective assets, I'm not going to go over all of those, of course, but some of the key things in here: real-time ambient occlusion, real-time accurate shadows, cameras and skeletons that can come from Maya and Max back and forth to Mudbox. And the single-click round trip with Maya Max is also nice. And of course we mentioned the auto and manual retopology that now exists within Mudbox as well. So painting and sculpting tool sets, quite simple. We have the sculpting tool tray, the paint tool tray, curve tools, pose tools, and select move tools. These are quite simply laid out into the bottom of your interface within Mudbox. Very simple to use and adjust to what your liking may be for sculpting. Stencils and Stamps, these are some of the default stencils and stamps. Let's take a look at some of the real, or some of the using textures or stencils and stamps here. Here's a traditional clay pipeline where you have this process of sculpting, casting, scanning, cleaning, building the model, baking, and publishing the model. In Mudbox, our goal here is to have a model that we've sculpted up and then be able to use retopology tools and publish that asset back to whatever package you're working with for your rigging, for example. So in sculpting in Mudbox, typically for organic tools, we're going to be looking at foamy, wax, smooth, and grab. We're going to take a look at these here in a moment as just a quick demo here in Mudbox. And then for hard surface techniques, I'm not going to get into a lot of those right now, but these are some of the tools that are excellent for hard surfacing techniques: flattening, pinch, scrape, fill, and sculpt. I do have a couple videos on YouTube that utilize some hard surfacing techniques doing exactly this, using these tools within Mudbox as well. So let's get into Mudbox and really quickly take a look at this process of taking our base mesh and being able to sculpt it up. So as I mentioned before, typically what I would do is start with the wax brush, and I'm going to turn my mirroring on in here, and let's just quickly look at how this might work. I can hit my W key to turn wireframe off if I want, or just stroke down by hitting right click. I'm using a stylus here within Mudbox to sculpt with, which I'd recommend you do. And I'm stepping up to level 2 subdivision here, which is not much, we're at 60,000 polys. And then what we can start to do with the wax brush, if we take a look at our fall off, I'm going to use this kind of bold fall off and begin to kind of build in some of this muscle form and structure. I don't really care about how smooth or fine it is right now. Right now we're just concerned with the overall function or structure of the musculature of the creature. So let's just rough a lot of this in here. And this is just using the wax brush as we go, building up some of these muscle forms as they may exist for the creature. And this is again where you're going to have your reference library open for you so that you can see how that's going to work. I'm not going to spend too much time, and I'm going to step up here so that we can see some of these muscle forms that are built in. Again, I'm using symmetry. Once you get further on, you would start to turn symmetry off and actually build asymmetrical functions into the creature. Nothing's perfectly symmetrical, so it's always a good idea to kind of beat up your creature asymmetrically there as well. And then just stepping up here into level 3, we're working in some more of the anatomical details of some of the anatomical forms. Here you can see that I have these different kind of adjustment layers where I could start to adjust the overall silhouette if I wanted to on that creature. I'm just going to keep moving forward here and step up into some of these wrinkles. This is just using a foamy brush, and all I'm doing here is sculpting in simple little foamy wrinkles by taking the foamy brush. We can bring this guy down a little bit and maybe keeping it, something like that. And then something that really helps here as well is if we turn on the steady stroke, this is an excellent way to kind of guide in those wrinkles as I go. I might want to turn the strength up on that so that I can drag that across the surface. And you'll see how easy that is to kind of get those wrinkles in there as well as we go. Really simple way to do that. And then I could start to build in more wrinkles around the head. Here's the overall form or structure of that head. I'm keeping everything on layers. I recommend you do that. Keep everything on layers within Mudbox to keep everything separate. Here's a line, this tempo line that kind of defines, breaks up the character a bit, and also is an excellent way for when you get into texture painting, utilizing a structure like that to kind of break the contrast up, right? Something maybe a little lighter on the belly and darker on the top of the structure, or vice versa, depending on what the look is you're going for. Now when we get into the finite details here, we step up to a much higher resolution. We're working here at about just shy of 4 million polys, and we can start to get into things like these small scales that have been sculpted across this. And this is where maybe I'm sculpting some of these by hand, for example, some of these down here, or I'm using existing stencils and stamps. So let's take a look at those. If I go into my sculpt brush, and go into my image browser, I have an entire library here I like to use of stamps and stencils for building out overall structures to detail in that mesh. So for example, if we grab this guy here and brought that in, I can hit this little icon to bring that in as a stencil. And then what I can do with this stencil in here, I'm going to turn off invert values and use the values as they are right now. Now just to note, I am using mirroring still on this. I can turn that off, but if I want to lay down some quick kind of structure on here, I'm going to change my fall. I'll make sure my fall off's on that there. I may want to up the strength or down the strength depending on the result that I'm going to get. And you can see that I'm able to rather quickly kind of build in some simple details just by rubbing in a stencil that is there, a texture for that matter. And a nice way to preview the results of that is to come in the viewport filters and turn on things like cavity, ambient occlusion, and that's going to show you the overall result on there. You can see that I mirrored that stencil as I work there as well. Another just quick example with the sculpt brush here. Let's turn off our stencil. Going back here, we might want to have something like specific, stamps that we want to use. I'm going to bring this in as a stamp. And then I'm actually going to, let's bring this in as the imprint brush here using this, we'll bring this guy in. You can see the stamp that I'm utilizing on the imprint brush. The imprint brush is very cool in the way that what it allows me to do is quickly just drag out an area here and kind of hammer in a detail. So for example, if I want a smaller detail on there, I can just kind of position that as I want it to be, and I can quickly put a bunch of those in. And this is nice just to use that to position this along there, and I can do this with all sorts of different stamps as well. Of course, I can use the sculpt brush to do the same. Let's take a look at some of the final results in here. Just working away on some of these finite details in here, you can see that we're starting to build up some of the scales or structures on the creature. We're getting in some of the more finite scales as we go. And of course, I'm using my cavity ambient occlusion viewport filter as I go along to take a look at how those details are coming along. The last thing we want to take a look at here, if I turn off isolate, you'll see that we have all these different props that are associated with this creature, the saddles, the reins, all these different things, and those are sculpted and painted within Mudbox as well. So let's step out of here and move back into our PowerPoint here, just looking at some of the sculpting, the finite details, these cracks, for example, on the crest or the head of the creature as we work. I wanted to do a quick mention of vector displacement. I'm not going to go into big detail on it here, but vector displacement is an excellent way of actually creating sculpting tools for your pipeline for sculpting. You can extract full maps of creatures for this for a render pipeline, but it's actually a really effective way to create stamps and stencils to sculpt with. So here's a simple polyplane that I sculpted this structure in, and I wanted to use this as a chest plate on this kind of alien-like creature that I built. And by building this with these crazy little overhangs and undercuts, something that a regular displacement map would not be able to grab, I can create a library of things like this and begin to place it on this creature. So you can see here the chest of this creature here by just simply building a library of that. Look at these overhanging jaws or teeth on this structure here. This is what a vector displacement map looks like, these weird hues of green, blue, and red. And then I'm placing that in the jaw structure of this creature. And I can build up a library of that so that if I have a bunch of different creatures, I can be assured that the overall look and feel of them are going to match because of the, I have a library of these certain features that are sculpted maybe in a similar look or development in that way. And here's the typical default ear that comes with Mudbox, and these are some stamps that I've built so that I can quickly go in, and they work excellent for nice hard surfaced edges. Like you can see this detail on this little rivet as we go. So details in vector displacement, I wrote a chapter for game development tools using vector displacement as a sculpting workflow to build tools like that. You can take a look at that. I have a couple videos on YouTube for how to create vector displacement stamps in Mudbox. A couple different videos there. And of course the documentation from Mudbox is an excellent source. I'm not going to go too deep into PTEX here. There is another webinar you can take a look at, which is the Freedom from UV's PTEX Painting of Mudbox 2014 that came out in June 2013. You can take a look at that video available there on PTEX and Mudbox and how you can use a UV-less workflow. Mudbox file formats, FBX, OBJ, and Mud. That's its Mudbox file format. Textures in and out, as you saw, I was using PNG and TIFFs for the most part for my my stamps and stencils. And then Mudbox rendering menu. These are turntables and images that are excellent within Mudbox to just be able to create very quick ways of getting the proof of concept out for art direction or creative direction. Creating these simple renders here to be able to take a look at a nice quick render out of Mudbox to be able for approval purposes. Here's some images. You can render actually really high resolution imagery. I've actually rendered something out at 16K before right out of Mudbox and used for print. So you can certainly take imagery here for art direction or creative direction and use this for the approval purposes right out of Mudbox. So I'm going to end it here, and here's some additional resources. You can certainly look at more webinars that are available online. You can download a 30-day trial of Mudbox from the site. And of course, the area is an excellent resource for tutorials and other things that may exist to help you with your workflow within Mudbox, Maya, or whatever package you're utilizing within the Autodesk pipeline. So again, my name is Craig Barr. There's my email, my contact. I run a blog on the area. Please take a look at that. Follow me on Twitter at The Mudroom for anything related to sculpting, modeling, these different workflows. And of course, the YouTube channel for Autodesk Mudbox. I put a bunch of videos up there related to Mudbox and how it exists within production. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope that you found this useful. Thanks, guys.